Hello, everyone. So, we are entering Unit 2 with the road to conflict, where we are going to eventually get into the Revolutionary War. So, let's get to it. So, first, we're going to start out with the French and Indian War. You have learned about this before in world history, so it should be a review. So, the French Indian War, also referred to as the Seven Years' War, officially started in 1756, but really a state of war had already existed in North America since about 1754. And the peace treaty that resolved the war was signed in 1763. So, this was the name to the final phase in the very long struggle between France and Great Britain for dominance in North America and basically for supremacy in the world as a whole. France's expansion into the Ohio River Valley brought this repeated conflict with the claims of the British colonies and a series of different battles that led to the official British declaration of war officially in 1756. In this war, the title can be confusing, but there are essentially two sides. You have the French and their native allies, in which we'll talk about that in just a little bit, and the French colonists, obviously, that were living there at the time. And then on the other side, you have the British and their colonists that were living there. And on their side, they have some very powerful native allies that eventually help turn the tide of the war in their favor. So you have this area in red. I'm going to draw your attention right here. You have this area in red that in the beginning, the disputes were lying here. And a lot of the problems stemmed from the colonies wanting to expand west. And the French and the natives that were already living there, they were not having it. They did not want any part of that. So keep in mind that the British and the French had been at odds for hundreds of years. This kind of was the culmination of their rivalry. Okay, so this is a political cartoon from the era. It was actually penned by Benjamin Franklin, none other. This is known as the Join or Die political cartoon. So basically, it tried to persuade the colonies to unify together and help fight in the French and Indian War. And it was published in the Pennsylvania Gazette. So this was at the Albany Congress, and this was weeks before the war even began. And at this time, Benjamin Franklin, had actually even presented a plan for a unified colonial government that included a legislature, had delegates that were chosen by colonial assemblies, and an executive branch that would be headed by a president or a general of some sort appointed by the British Crown. So this is where the cartoon actually came in, and the delegates rejected that plan. And so here with this political cartoon, you see that the different colonies are going to be represented by the pieces of the snake. If you cut out any piece of the snake, if they are not joined together, what's going to happen to the snake? It's going to die. So you need everyone in order to be successful. So in the beginning, France, which you had seen, let me go back, they actually had a lot of the territory. And so, due to this and other reasons, they win a lot of battles early on. So, things actually started to take a turn whenever the financing for the war was boosted by the future Prime Minister William Pitt. He saw the colonial conflicts as an opportunity, as the key, really, to building a vast British empire and making them better than before. So eventually he had to borrow heavily to finance the war. And then he reimbursed the colonies for raising troops in North America. So the British military effort, unfortunately for them, was kind of hampered, I guess you could say, by a lack of interest at home. But the French had a lot more success in winning the support of the natives at the beginning. So the French, in the beginning, they won a string of victories. And in that string of victories, you have pictured a young George Washington who was caught in the middle of that, also with General Edward Braddock. So later on, you have the tides beginning to turn. The tides begin to turn with victories at Louisburg, and other French Canadian strongholds like Quebec. So the end of the war, basically, the majority of the natives throughout the French Indian War, they would fight with the French, but not all of them. The Iroquois decided to come to the British side eventually because whenever the Albany Congress had they had attempted to basically recruit them by giving them different gifts. They promised them that they would basically help them out with their grievances and make them feel better, essentially. It didn't really sway the Iroquois, though, and they decided to stay neutral. But after the war began and the Iroquois watched the British, and they thought that they would lose the war. So they were like, okay, we're not going to join. But they saw the tide begin to turn. And so, realizing that the British might win, the Iroquois decided that it would be beneficial overall for them to be on the winning side. So, the Iroquois, they come to the side of the British and the British colonists. And so, like I said, whenever Quebec is captured, that is a major port for the French. So at the 1763 Peace Conference, the British, they actually received territories of Canada, from France and Florida, from Spain, opening up the Mississippi Valley to westward expansion, which is what a lot of this was based around to begin with. So in the end, the French are defeated and lose a lot of their lands in North America. So you can tell from before the war, the orange was the land from the French. And then later on, a lot of their land is gone. Back on the map from the previous slide, you have this red line that pops up. And we are going to talk about what this red line is. So with the French and Indian War, yes, it is a victory for the British. However, it sets the stage for conflict between the British and their colonies. And here you have two main reasons. We'll talk about those. Number one is the Proclamation of 1763. So you have that red proclamation line right here that we're looking at. This was at the end of the French and Indian War, and it's to check for the pushing beyond the borders of European settlers on natives' lands. And it essentially created a boundary known as the Proclamation Line, separating the British colonies on the Atlantic coast, so over here, from the American Indian lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. So basically, they could remain settled over here to the red line. So the British Empire in general began to tighten control over the colonies who had basically functioned among themselves. And so the idea here was, remember, to appease the Native Americans, to hope to basically avoid further conflict with them. In the beginning, only licensed traders would be allowed to travel west of the line, or to have any sort of dealings with the natives. And so theoretically, it was protecting both sides, really. Colonists from native attacks, natives from increasingly frequent attacks by white settlers. And in the beginning, it was introduced as a temporary measure. And so its economic benefits for the British prompted different ministers to keep it until right up to the Revolutionary War. So this would limit trade with the colonists and the natives, and so it made for more goods to England. However, you have the colonists who see this, or they know this land is over here, and they see that it's good farmland, and a lot of them decide to defy the proclamation. A lot of people just resented the fact that the royal that the crown had placed so many restrictions on trade and migration. And then ultimately, this did fail to stem this tide, I guess you could say, of westward expansion. They still wanted to move west, whether they were appeasing the natives or not. So in the end, the proclamation did anger the colonists. They moved past that line, made the colonists believe that the British didn't care about their interests. They were concerned about their trading and appeasing the natives, which we're not going to discount making the natives happier because we all know that relationship was strained for obvious reasons. Okay, reason number 2. With more and more British expenses piling up, it led to increased taxes. So by January of 1763, Great Britain's national debt was more than 122 million pounds. Pounds, that's their monetary unit. That was an enormous amount of money for the time. So, and think about this as well. Interest on the debt was more than 4.4 million pounds a year. That is a lot, especially back then. So figuring out how to pay the interest alone absorbed the attention of the king and his advisors. And they had been spending so much money for the French and Indian War. You're thinking soldiers, thinking supplies, and they also started to keep soldiers in the colonies as well. And this was a constant expense. The idea to keep those troops in the colonies was to maintain law and order, and it was a big challenge for them. However, they felt that the expense was necessary, so they decided to increase taxes. So in 1764, you had the Sugar Act that's passed. It's an attempt to raise revenue in the colonies through a tax on sugar and molasses. This tax had been on the books since the 1730s. Because of smuggling and a lack of enforcement, it wasn't necessarily a major problem at the time. Another part of this was that people who were smuggling would be tried in British courts, not colonial courts. So if you are, or if you're a British court, you are going to try someone a lot more strict than you would in a colonial court because you have different motives there. Now the tax was definitely to be enforced, and so there was a major outcry. And you see the colonists begin to organize formal protests and a boycott of British goods. Later on, it's appealed, which essentially means to withdraw, revoke, or annul. But it left people with a very bad taste in their mouth. All right, so that is where we are actually going to end. So I hope you all have a good rest of your day.